Good evening. My name is Alvino Castillo, and I currently serve as the treasurer of the Medgar and Merle Evers Institute. And one of the core mission statements of our organization relates to voter registration and voting rights. So this is certainly an appropriate occasion for the Institute to be represented here. I am actually standing in for our executive director, Rena Evers Everett, who would be here except that she had a family emergency that kept her in Georgia, and so she asked me to stand in. The Institute has a partnership with Millsaps that we're proud to be involved in because we share so many common themes in terms of our missions. I am actually an alumnus of Millsaps. Many years ago, I remember sitting in this same room on many occasions. And Millsaps has always had a rich history of being an institution that encouraged and served as a forum for free exchange of ideas and causes that in some instances weren't very popular, but it also always provided academic freedom and an opportunity for free expression, and it's often on the leading edge. I recall when I was at Millsaps, and also did my MBA here and had an opportunity to serve on the Board of Trustees as well. But I remember when I was here, one year I was president of, at that time we called it the Black Student Association. And we had an opportunity to bring in, I never will forget, Charles Evers, when he was making a run for governor, that was sort of a cutting edge event. And then we had one year Ms. Fannie Lou Hamer to come speak to us, and that was really, we didn't realize at the time the greatness and what that meant, but I still remember that and cherish that opportunity. So I'm happy to, on behalf of the Medgar and Merle Evers Institute in partnership with Millsaps, welcome you to this event. We have a great set of panelists. And just two more things I want to talk about. When the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, my father, who worked at the post office at the time, was one of a relatively small number of men who were appointed by President Johnson to be federal voting registrars across the South. And he worked some in the Delta of Mississippi, but also most of the time he spent in Birmingham, and that was registering many black people for the first time, registering them to vote. And I remember he would spend the week in Birmingham and come back home on the weekends, and it was a hairy time. I mean, it was a little bit scary time because we didn't, it was still dangerous when you talked about registering to vote at that time. And I just want to read something here, and I'll be through. This is from the autobiography of Medgar Evers, a book written by Manny Marable. Very good book, and it's what it is. It's a collection of speeches and writings and a lot of, it's just chock full of information about the man and what he did in terms of voter registration, fighting for voting rights at a very dangerous time. The man had no fear. And so I'm really proud to be, that's one of the driving forces of my commitment to this institute. But this is just an excerpt from the New York Post. It's a transcript, part of a transcript of an interview of Medgar Evers by a CBS reporter, Bill Peters. And it was in 1962, but aired in full in the days immediately following Medgar Evers' assassination on June 12th, 1963. And one of the questions that was posed was by Mr. Peters to Medgar Evers, and during these 8 years, has there been an NAACP effort towards getting Negroes to vote and register? The response, yes, there has been all over the state an effort to get Negroes registered to vote in most of the counties where we're organized, and even a number of counties where we're not organized. We think now in terms of back in 1954 and 55, when up in Belzona, Mississippi, which is in Humphreys County, we had a very active chapter getting Negroes registered to vote. He goes on to talk about specifics. But one of the things he talks about in the next response is to the question about if it has become more or less difficult to register, for black people to register in Mississippi. Well, of course it was going to be more difficult. But anyway, the answer was, well, I would say that it has become in some instances more difficult for them to register, and in other instances possibly less difficult. I think in terms of some of the counties that I've mentioned, since 1954, they passed a literacy bill which requires all persons to fill out a form consisting of some 21 questions, and they make it most difficult for Negroes to register. For example, if you fail to cross your T or dot an I, in a number of instances, Negroes are refused the right to register. In other instances, we find they're not even given the application form to fill out. And he goes on to talk about how the process, in some cases, the applicant had to answer how many bubbles were in a bar of soap, and so forth. But then he goes on to talk about how his goal was not just for black people to become registered voters, but he felt like everyone should be able to register and vote and to elect those officials who are going to best serve their community. So, although first and foremost he realized his mission was to enable the black community to do better, have better opportunities, and remove the obstacles to registering and voting. But he was cognizant and wanted that for everyone because he understood the power of the ballot. So thank you. I know I've taken probably more time than I intended, but thank you for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to the panel.
So welcome again, everyone. Thank you so much, Alvino. That was really meaningful to hear. We really appreciate your participation, and you're representing the Medgar and Myrlie Evers Institute, which is a key partner for the Millsaps community as well. This event actually emerges from partnership between Millsaps, the Medgar and Myrlie Evers Institute, Mississippi Today, and the Millsaps Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center. I'm going to say just a very few words, and then I'm going to turn the show over to our moderator, Arika Bennett-Scott. I just want to note really quickly that this event and the idea that we would be developing some programming around the election really originated in an idea that a Millsaps student had, a student who's in this room, Adam Matij, who came to me at the end of the spring semester with the idea that Millsaps should do some programming at this moment in time, given the stakes of the present. My colleagues, Victoria Gorham and Dr. Eric Schmidt in the Department of Government and Politics have been crucial in helping bring our guests here to campus for this event. So Dr. Gorham and Dr. Schmidt, we thank you so much for your help. And also Susan Womack, who is the head of our Millsaps Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center, is one of the unsung heroes in the Millsaps campus, and she has been so instrumental not only to this, but to so many meaningful and impactful events in the Millsaps community. So Susan, I want to thank you really quickly as well. I'm overwhelmed by how impressive our panelists are, and their biographies are so incredible that I could spend the rest of our hour just introducing them properly. And I feel that it would be both right to do that, but also in the interest of letting them take the show, I'm just going to read very quick bits about each of our panelists. We are so delighted that Arika Bennett Scott will be our moderator today. Arika is the executive director of Mississippi Votes, a statewide, millennial-led, civic engagement nonprofit organization that has registered over 50,000 young people across the state of Mississippi and engaged most of Mississippi's growing electorate. She's pursuing a master's degree in gender leadership and public policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And she's been the recipient of the NAACP Medgar Evers Award, the Emerson Collective Fellowship, the Unida Blackwell Justice Award, and Mississippi Votes were also recognized as the Community Organization of the Year in Mississippi. To her left is Valencia Richardson from the Campaign Legal Center in Washington, D.C. Valencia is prior to joining the CLC, she was a voting rights organizer and activist. And before law school, Valencia was a Fulbright Fellow, grantee to Mexico, and a student voting rights organizer for the Andrew Goodman Foundation. She is the author of a nonfiction book, Young and Disaffected, and published Voting While Poor, Reviving the 24th Amendment and Eliminating the Modern Day Poll Tax in the Georgetown Journal on Poverty Law and Policy. She's a graduate of the Georgetown University Law Center and Louisiana State University and is admitted to practice law in the District of Columbia. She joined the CLC in 2020 as an Equal Justice Works Fellow. Next, we have Joshua Tom, who is the legal director of the ACLU of Mississippi and a Jackson, Mississippi resident. Josh descends from the Chinese American community in the Mississippi Delta. Originally from Memphis, Tennessee, he studied English literature and economics at Vanderbilt University and Boston University. He practiced corporate litigation in New York before moving to Mississippi to practice civil rights law. At the ACLU of Mississippi, he has litigated cases on environmental justice, policing, LGBTQ rights, voting rights, and other areas. He has 3 active cases on redistricting, one for the state legislature, one regarding the Mississippi Supreme Court, and one for DeSoto County. And last but certainly not least, we have Vangela M. Wade, who is president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Justice, a nonprofit public interest law firm for racial, economic, and social justice. Vangela Wade has a 20-year record with MCJ of fighting for equity in housing, voting rights, health care, and other issues. Under her leadership, the Mississippi Center for Justice launched projects focused on heirs property, education, broadband, civic engagement, and government accountability. The organization has championed Medicaid expansion, represented the only abortion clinic in Mississippi in Dobbs versus Jackson Women Health Organization, the Supreme Court case that overturned Roe versus Wade, and pioneered work in fair housing that led Mississippi to rewrite its eviction laws. Vangela Wade has received numerous honors throughout her career, including the MCJ's 2024 Champion of Justice Catalyst for Change Award, appointment to the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Planning Committee for Empowering Justice 40 communities, the Magnolia Bar Association's Legal Services Award, the Metro Jackson Black Women Lawyers Association Attorney of the Year, the National Bar Association Women Lawyers Division 50th Anniversary Impact Award, and Black Voices for Black Justice honoree. As you can see, it's a stellar group, and I can't wait to hear what they say. Arika, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much, and please join me in welcoming our guests.
Good evening. I am so excited that you all get to eavesdrop on this conversation I'm going to have with my friends. So I am honored to share this moment in time and space with these brilliant, amazing thinkers and trailblazers in the field of voting rights. And, voting isn't just about casting a ballot on election day. It's about folks having a voice about the policies that affect their everyday lives. And each of these organizations that are represented here tonight are doing amazing work in fighting for voting rights. So I want to lead the conversation with, what do each of you consider to be the most significant barrier to that voters face in Mississippi in terms of voting rights, and how are your organizations working to overcome those barriers? And we'll start in the middle.
So unfortunately, in Mississippi, there's political scientists here and maybe political science students, and I don't know if this is the exact term, but the meaning of it is the cost of voting. The cost of voting in Mississippi is very high. For example, you have to there's very specific times limits when you can register to vote. There's very specific times when you can actually vote. There's no online voter registration. There's limited absentee ballot voting, et cetera. And when all of those stack up, it makes the voter turnout much lower than it could otherwise be. And unfortunately, given the history of voting in Mississippi, a lot of that is intentional. It's an intentional result to have that low voter turnout. And so I think my answer to that question is the unfortunate state is that there's many, many barriers to voting in Mississippi.
And I know that ACLU is working particularly on the legislative front to make sure that some of those barriers are removed. So before we go to Vangela, can you talk a little bit about the work that ACLU is doing to make sure that those barriers to voting are removed?
Yeah, so the ACLU is if y'all aren't familiar with it, we're not the most popular organization in Mississippi, probably one of the least popular organizations. And so, our efforts in the legislature, while we think valiant, or a lot of times they're not very successful, but a lot of the things that we advocate for in the legislature are things that we think are basic, and actually when you look across the country are basic. So early voting, online voter registration, things as simple as that. That we think can make voting easier, we think can make the voter turnout higher. And so it's unfortunately just basic things that we're asking the legislature to do that to date they have not done.
So, Vangela, same question. Yeah.
I was waiting for the special question.
Oh, I could give you a special question?
No. As Joshua just said, we have many barriers in Mississippi, and that has been, it's nothing new. It's almost it's the same old song, if you would. Of course, economic barriers. You've got information barriers, education barriers, barriers that are, geographical, where you have people who live in rural areas that don't have access to transportation to get to polling places that are often changed in the middle of, an election cycle. My father, for instance, who I grew up in Northeast Mississippi, in Verona, Mississippi. My father, who's 83 years old, has been going to the same polling place all of his voting life, which was the little city hall in Verona, Mississippi. Well, the last election, he went to vote, and they told him, well, Mr. Williams, you don't vote here. You've got to go to Brewer. Well, thank goodness, at 83, he's still driving, self-sufficient. So he was able to drive, back to Brewer, Mississippi, where he's never voted, whole different group of, poll workers and that sort of thing, people that don't necessarily know him. So to have that switch, that change with people who are either elderly, disabled, who don't have, where access can be a barrier. But I would also say, education around the issue. Why should I go and vote? I read something recently that a person who was interviewed about, whether or not they were going to vote, and the person, and this was a relatively, young person, who said, well, why should I vote? Nothing is going to change. I would rather go and work and make that $18 or $12 an hour or $7.25 an hour, rather than stand in line and vote for something that's not going to change. So I think we've got to move. Not only do we have the barriers, but then when we start looking at what may be some of the, and I don't want to say solutions, because I think we're in a cycle here and we will always be, but how could we impact a person's concerns or a person's impression that their vote doesn't matter? I think is getting to people, as Mississippi Votes does, as MCJ does, and ACLU, to talk about whether or not there's election or not, why does this issue matter?
Right.
What matters around your kitchen table as to why you should have a voice and you should make your voice heard in an election, regardless of whether it's a national election, local election, school board election even. So, yeah, so barriers that certainly we can't, that have existed forever, but those that may not be as apparent.
Yeah, Vangela, you said a lot that strikes a different question for you, Valencia, as someone who works for a national, ACLU is a national organization, but a more national approach to voting rights. And so Mississippi has some of the strictest voting laws in the country, not to mention our felony disenfranchisement laws. And so I wonder if you could help our audience understand just how extreme our voting laws are in Mississippi.
Yeah, you put me in the position of telling you why why it's one of the worst. No, I think to your point, I actually think that voter registration is by far, I think across the country, voter registration is way too hard. But in Mississippi, it's way too hard to register to vote in Mississippi. The fact that Mississippi is one of the only 2 states that doesn't have online voter registration at this point.
One of the how many?
Yeah, Texas is the only other one that doesn't allow some form of online voter
One
registration.
of the how many? Say that.
Yeah.
2. Okay.
Yeah, I think that it's way too hard to register to vote in Mississippi. The fact that there are so many misconceptions about who's eligible with a felony conviction in Mississippi is really hard. But Mississippi also, I think, is only one of 3 states that permanently disenfranchises certain people with felony convictions, and that's a vestige of Jim Crow. And so the only other states that do permanent disenfranchisement, and by permanent I mean the only way you get your rights back is by a pardon from the governor or some other, in Mississippi it's the legislature, but you can't, in the 47 other states there's a process by which you can seek restoration yourself. And the only other states that don't have that process is Mississippi, Tennessee, and Virginia, 3 Confederate strongholds. And so the felony disenfranchisement is an area which I work on a lot, but that's a really, I think, a really tough battle here in Mississippi, if not for not even knowing who is eligible as a result. I think a lot of people don't know that there are a lot of people with felony convictions in Mississippi who are eligible to register, and I think there are a lot of people with felony convictions that don't know that they're eligible. And so that alone, that education and information barrier for that is disenfranchising probably thousands of people here. I think that when it comes to polling place consolidation in Mississippi, so just a little bit of background, if you're familiar with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the protections it used to provide under federal law known as preclearance, where certain states with a history of voting discrimination had to submit their election changes to the federal government. That ended with a Supreme Court decision in 2013. And when what we've seen in Mississippi versus the rest of the region, a lot of the states that had to submit their election laws, it was basically the entire Deep South. All of the states with a history of voting discrimination are mostly located in the South and Southwest. And what we saw is there are studies that show that after Shelby County, the number of polling places that were closed or consolidated, particularly in African-American neighborhoods, decreased rapidly. So the physical, actual number of places to vote have decreased in the last decade in Mississippi. That's a problem for all the reasons Angela mentioned about if there are longer drive times, people have to take off more time from work to vote in person. That's especially important in a place like Mississippi that doesn't have early voting and has very limited absentee voting. And so the vast majority of people in this state will vote on election day. And so if you limit the number of polling places, you're making it harder for the vast majority of people to cast their ballot. And so I think those are some of I would say 3 buckets of issues where I think Mississippi stands out nationally.
Yeah, and speaking of that, Valencia, your work focuses on compliance with the Voting Rights Act. Just to refresh everyone's memory, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act prohibits policies that result in the denial or abridgment of the right to vote of any citizen of the United States. And one reason Section 2 is so important is that it gives us vocabulary, a very expansive vocabulary, if you will, for talking about and noticing racial discrimination in elections. With that in mind, what are the Section 2 violations that don't get the attention they should, even from the outlets that care about civil rights? Like, what do we need to be talking about that we're not talking about?
Polling places.
Yeah.
I think if I could tackle one issue with respect to potential voting discrimination in Mississippi and in lots of other places, it would be how hard it is to tackle. It's incredibly hard to tackle because those decisions happen at the county level. They're hyper-local, but the consolidation of polling precincts in neighborhoods of color is a real problem and a vestige of losing other provisions of the Voting Rights Act that I mentioned. And I think that Section 2 hasn't been used enough to tackle those really insidious polling place changes that occur in predominantly Black communities where you've, elderly people who've voted at the same place for decades all of a sudden don't have the same polling place anymore. That we see that all the time, and I think that's one that we really.
And we've seen that right here in Hinds County. Jackson sits in Hinds County, one of the blackest cities in the country.
Yeah.
And on Election Day in 2023, Angela, you know this, there were a number of inaccuracies that happened on Election Day. And I know we can talk about this now. We had to file a suit the day of election because there weren't a sufficient amount of ballots printed, but not just ballots being printed. We're talking about people not knowing that their polling places were consolidated until the day of Election Day. And so it's a more systemic problem than I think we realize. And Evangela, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the work of MCJ when it comes to making sure the community knows their rights, number one, and then two, how we're spreading the word about and holding the Secretary of State's office accountable for those polling place precinct changes.
Well, I'll just say this with what you're talking about, Erika, with regards to Hinds County, what I call the election debacle or the debacle of 2023, where people went to places that they thought, based on even MapQuest, was a particular polling place, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. And the county or the election commissioner for that particular precinct or area had not provided accurate signage. MCJ works in community to, one, we set up in conjunction with Mississippi Votes, LDF in Hinds County, set up what we call a boiler room, where if there are voting issues that arise on the day of voting, where we would, people are dispatched to these various places to figure out what's going on and try to find, get recourse for that or to address those issues, including litigation to hold the polling places open past 7 o'clock when you have people in line as a result of having inaccurate or not enough ballots. But we also, in Mississippi Delta, we've created what we call a civic engagement and government accountability project, where we are working in community, at least across 13 Mississippi Delta counties, where we're working to do what I talked about earlier, connect people in the in this process by connecting, helping them to realize how the issue impacts how this issue and voting connects. Where is their power to help change their lives? And so, for example, coming up, we have on October 18th in Indianola at our offices, we will be featuring what we call Breaking Down the Ballot and Amnesty Day, where we are so we're trying to, as someone said a few years ago, we're going to feed one bird with two scones. Get it? We're not killing birds anymore with stones. We're feeding them with scones. But we're going to have we're inviting the communities across the Delta to come in to learn about the various issues that are really social determinants of quality of life, whether it's health, education, economics, any social justice issue that we're working on, and how those issues how they can affect those issues at the polling place. But at the same time, on that day, they can come in and get an expungement. And we have worked it out with the county officials where there won't be any fees or that are fines that people may have had levied against them. Those will be dropped. Those will be forgiven so that they can move forward with the expungement, so that they can at some point, if they've been barred from voting, that may, eventually that can be worked out. But also people will find out on that day also whether or not they've been barred from voting. And as Valencia said, many people are walking around today thinking that they can't vote because they are quote unquote a felon, but those only impact certain felonies. So, educating people is what MCJ does, along with direct legal services and litigation.
Yeah, one of my favorite partnerships is working with MCJ. We, just to say this to the students in the room, we have a poll monitoring program that we're recruiting poll monitors for this upcoming election cycle. And so Jada from Mississippi Votes is in the back, and she can tell you how to get signed up. It's a paid opportunity, students. Okay? All right. Shameless plug. But we talked a little bit about misinformation, and I think that's so important. And so, Josh, between you and Vangela, could you talk a little bit about like how crucial the role of good information getting is in the work that we do? Because, there's a big role that misinformation, disinformation plays, especially in the media and social media, people getting information from all over the place. And how can we counteract that? And what is your organization doing to do that? I know you talked about the education forums, Vangela, but what else can we do, particularly here on a college campus where students are getting their information maybe from each other or from, is it X now or is it Twitter still? Is it X? Okay, we can call it X.
I'll step in first, Josh, and then if you would help me out here. Just go to actual sites that are either the state, for instance, if it's the Secretary of State website, or even organizations like Mississippi Votes or MCJ's website, ACLU, but other official websites. I had an interview the other day with investigative reporter Jerry Mitchell from Mississippi Today, and he talked about the difference between, some of the journalists of traditional journalists as opposed to people who are just putting out information, and that's often what you will get in social media, whether it's on X or Q or R or whatever. I'm not a social media person, as you can tell. But getting information from individuals who are giving their opinion and trying to, impact the outcome or impact your behavior just based on their opinion, as opposed to where you can get factual information from various governmental websites.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to slightly turn that question on its head, in addition to organizations like ours educating people on voting rights, it's unfortunate that one of the bodies or one of the officials who is best positioned to be able to do that doesn't do that on certain areas or doesn't do it enough.
Are you talking about the Secretary of State?
Which is the Secretary of State.
I gave bad information.
Just say his name.
But, no, what you find on the Secretary of State's office is accurate, but this is an example of how they could do more. So, like, for example, on felon disenfranchisement, people are not clear whether they are actually disenfranchised or not, and I actually took the testimony of the Assistant Secretary of State who oversees the election division. He's basically the head election official just under Secretary of State Watson. And he said that besides putting which crimes are disenfranchising on their website, they don't do anything else. And so, like, if the Secretary of State were to want to educate people on whether they could vote or not, you think that they have a pretty big platform to be able to do that. And they could have a big platform to be able to do that on any number of issues. So it's unfortunate in some ways that that burden falls on us to be able to get out this additional information.
Yeah.
And if I could just add, as a matter of fact, that I believe Josh led to Paloma Wu, Deputy Director of Impact Litigation at MCJ, and I'm not sure she's working along with ACLU, SPLC, and others to compile, because this who can vote and who can't can often be really confusing with regards to this felony disenfranchisement, but working on a grid to provide this information so that people can have more accurate, clear information.
Right, right. The Secretary of State's office, about a week and a half ago, I don't know if it's tweeted or X'd, whatever. On social media, he X'd us or tweeted us. I don't know, Jada, how do you say it on Twitter? Sure, he tweeted Mississippi Votes about some canvassing that we were doing. And to Josh's point, a lot of the information that we share is strictly from the Secretary of State's website, because organizations like ours don't make the laws. We just make sure voters have the information about the laws. And so I think the messenger and the message is also just as important as the source you get it from. And so one of the sites that we often cite organizationally is obviously MCJ, ACLU, but Democracy Docket is a credible source because it's ran by lawyers who do a lot of investigative journalism and reporting on election laws in states like Mississippi. And so I'm always gonna go to bat for students. So if you're looking for sound information on like what to do on your college campus around voting and elections, those websites are certainly ones to go towards. We've been talking a lot about felony disenfranchisement, and I just want us to, maybe Josh, maybe you can talk about it a little bit better. Folks with felony convictions in Mississippi, it's just not about those 23 crimes that are listed on the voter registration form. As you mentioned, Vangela, those crimes can be broken down into subcategories of subcategories that equal up to about 300 or so crimes. And so when we're doing work like voter registration, how important is it, Joshua, to like make sure that folks have accurate information about who can and who cannot access the ballot, particularly this election cycle, after the Fifth Circuit ruling, for sure?
Yeah, and not necessarily on the felon disenfranchisement. There's other examples of aggressive prosecutors in Mississippi going after people who make a mistake on voting, say that they were registered in one county and voted in another county, or you see examples in other states where somebody who is disenfranchised because of a felony, they vote and they get prosecuted for it. And so it's not, and some of these things are just simple mistakes. Some people, there's no, like, a lot of times there's no intentionality requirement. It's not like, oh, I knew I was disenfranchised and then I intentionally voted. Some of these people just literally have no idea, and then they vote, and then it turns out that they're not, that they actually are disenfranchised. Those type of prosecutions, a lot of times, really make it scary to vote. People who do have a felony, well, they're like, well, I'm not going to do that. I mean, I may get prosecuted. Or, it's an example of another cost of voting. And if the information is not clear and the repercussions are very serious, it's just another reason why you're not going to vote. Which is also another reason why getting this information out, whether from our organizations or ideally from the Secretary of State, is even that much more important.
So really what you have, when you have states that won't provide, officials that won't provide accurate information, but you do hear and see the prosecution, that in itself acts as a, I would say, de facto voter suppression and disenfranchisement in and of itself.
I would also say that I think what's missing in the conversation about, the disenfranchising crimes is that that means there are a lot more crimes that are not disenfranchising that people don't know about. People don't know in Mississippi if you have a federal conviction versus an out-of-state conviction. I think most of those people do have the right to register, but it's a complicated process. I think that Josh is right that the people who there've been like aggressive examples, particularly in states like Texas, where people who genuinely didn't know and were being punished for a mistake, and it does create fear for people who are eligible to register and vote. And so I think that the lack of information not only creates fear, but also leaves room for bad actors to also create disinformation and misinformation because, relying on the lack of education and the lack of information that's been being provided. And so it sort of creates this narrative of voter fraud or what have you, because there's not enough information out there. I'd also be remiss not to plug CLC. We have a 50-state a website that shows how you are eligible to vote if you have a felony conviction in all 50 states, including Mississippi, called restoreyourvote.org. So I always plug that, but because the process is so difficult.
I read somewhere that Mississippi is America, and nobody wants to talk about America being undressed, but Mississippi is America undressed, right? And so I wonder if, because I see what happens here November 5th shaping the rest of the country, and so I wonder if each of you could talk about not just the political landscape in Mississippi and how it will impact the broader landscape of voting rights across the country, but in what ways this particular the outcome of this particular election will either strengthen or weaken our democracy.
Yeah, I think so. One thing that we work on at CLC is the prevention of election sabotage, the efforts to undermine the results of elections and to prevent the certification of elections. And I think one thing that is going to be really important in this election and will continue to be important is combating both the misinformation you described, but all of those narratives that are ultimately laying the groundwork to undermine the results of the election, as they attempted to do in 2020 unsuccessfully. But we'll try again to rely on people's fears and rely on people's lack of information about how elections work to say that the election was stolen, or say that, and you hear extremely egregious and false narratives about non-citizens voting that is just truly could not be less true. But it's all laying the groundwork to undermine the results of if a certain outcome doesn't come into fruition. And so I think the stakes of this election is, will we succumb to that misinformation? Will that misinformation result in the disenfranchisement of people who lawfully cast their ballot as a result of false narratives about voter fraud and non-citizen voting, all of which are just totally not tied to any facts or reality, but have just proliferated our culture in really dangerous ways. And so I think that is one thing that'll be really important, is ensuring that everybody's vote counts and ensuring that the election is certified, and ensuring that the Electoral College represents the will of the people. All of those things. I think election won't end on November 6th. It's going to last until the until the Electoral College begins on January 6th.
Right.
And we're gonna have to make sure that it gets there safely.
I would say, looking back at, the election in 2020 and what happened, everything, from January 6th on to, even before that, of trying to rig the various counties and request, certain candidates requesting certain number of votes, and everything that has happened since then, I think what we need, not just Mississippi, but
Yeah.
looking nationally, is people need to feel secure in our democracy, in our democratic processes. I think that is ultimately
Yeah.
what is at stake, even more so than getting in, a preferred candidate or not.
Absolutely.
It's making sure that people have trust in our systems that are built on trust and integrity and,
That's right.
For the most part, character. I keep thinking about, that there were certain things that were hollow and shallow as it relate to Black people in this country. But notwithstanding that, there was always a sense, I think, just looking back through history, of having a system in place that you could at least question and believe that with the laws that we have in place, that there would be proper redress at some point, or that that was available. But I think if we don't bring this back to at least that, place, that we're going to lose considerable ground, not only in what's at stake, but also, I think, in people believing that there's a reason for them to participate in these processes. That, to me, is scarier than possibly one, candidate or another. Is just being able to have faith and trust in this system.
And when you have bad actors who are seeking to, sow false information to undermine that trust, it's really scary, yeah.
Right. Josh, do you want to?
Just one example of how rhetoric in elections can be really important and can have real-world impacts. So, after 2020, there was the rhetoric from, former President Trump about, widespread election fraud and that, the election was stolen, et cetera. That narrative, as has already been discussed, has become quite widespread. Some people, some officials, I think, are cynically using that. Some people maybe, probably actually do believe that. But a real-world impact of that in Mississippi was that based on that rhetoric, we have at least one law that made voting in Mississippi more difficult and made voter registration in Mississippi lower. And they passed this law that allows you to be purged from the voter rolls simply by not voting. If you don't vote for a certain number of years, then you automatically will be purged from the voter rolls. And that law was passed in part on the narrative of widespread voter fraud. And so that's actually a real-world example that happened here based on the results. In this case, the loss of an election. So even if you lose, you could have negative impacts on voting.
And, we'd be remiss to not name this. We've gathered at one of the most significant liberal arts colleges in the Deep South, really, and the first white college in Mississippi to voluntarily integrate during the Civil Rights Movement. What should an institution like Millsaps College be doing to meet this particular moment? What is your message to the educators and the students that are attending the institution?
I think it's as simple as speaking up and speaking out. Because when you know better, you should do better. And we have to be the voices, not just of yesteryear when we were the first of, but now. It's more important to me in our time now is when we need to step up and show the character of our institutions and the character of our people who are running, who are leading the institutions, and the character of our people who are being educated at our institutions, because you're up next.
Right.
You see my gray hair or the lack of hair. I'm on my way out. You're up next. It's your turn. And if you don't speak up and out, you can't keep pulling back on Fannie Lou Hamer and Dr. King and Thurgood Marshall. They're gone. They're not coming back. It's you. It's you and it's you. And if you don't speak out, not only with your friends, neighbors, and countrymen, but also on the X and the Twitter and the whatever else it is, that's where you've got to make a difference. You can't sit quiet, because that means basically you're acquiescing. So it's time, the time is now, and the time is now for all of us to speak out for not only for now, but for tomorrow, for the next generation. But this is our time because we're here now. So let's take advantage of our power now.
I would say high tides lift all boats, and so you're in a very privileged position to be able to have the knowledge to understand, how to register and how to cast your ballot and how to exercise your constitutional rights. And I would use that knowledge and give it to others who aren't so blessed with these opportunities. I would register other voters or other potential voters. I would go out. I would volunteer to be a poll worker. I would try to beat back the very understandable sense of this doesn't matter. I know people love to make fun of students for being too apathetic. I actually very much empathize with why you might be apathetic in this moment. It feels very dark sometimes, but I would just really fight against that instinct, because the alternative is just too dire. We have to keep going, because the alternative just is not an option. The alternative, we have to create the multiracial democracy that we've been striving to create since the end of slavery. And we have to, we just have to, because the alternative is just not acceptable. And so I say small part, but I actually don't think it's small at all. Registering your fellow student, understanding what, forget about, I don't want to say forget about presidential election, but I think there are races down ballot that are arguably more important, and more important to your daily life, about understand how your county represents you, not just your president or your governor. Understand how your city represents you and how they're supposed to, right? And be involved at the local level. I think just remind yourself that we can't go back. The alternative is frankly just completely unacceptable. So we have to keep going, even though, like I said, even I get a little bit God, I'm just tired, tired. We're tired, but we're not that tired. That's what I think.
Yeah, and to even be in this room, this is everybody here is in either an ultimate, an objective, or a relatively privileged position. You sit in a private university, and having that level of privilege should be recognized. And on top of that, the platform of students and of universities can be quite large. You only have to look at the news over the past several months and years to see the megaphone that can be projected nationally and across the world from students and from college campuses.
I have so many more questions, but maybe I should open it up to the audience. Does anybody have questions for our amazing panelists? Because I could keep going. Yeah, let's do it.
What's your name?
Oh, I'm James. Hi. There's a lot of talk about voter ID laws and how they affect minorities. And I guess I was wondering if I could hear your guys' explanation, because I don't exactly grasp how asking somebody to show their ID affects minorities more than the regular person. So I was wondering if I could get an explanation from you guys.
Sure, I can start. I think, so voter ID laws, like other types of restrictions, come at a cost. Like Josh just explained the cost of voting. I think we take for granted the fact that getting a driver's license is actually a privilege that a lot of folks do not obtain. And so when we think about who is disproportionately more likely to be poor, it's going to be minority voters. Who's disproportionately more likely to not have a driver's license because they don't have a car? It's going to be minority voters. And so it's really, it's about availability and access and cost. It costs to get a driver's license. Who disproportionately has lower incomes? Minority voters. And so the cost, and you have to go to the DMV to get an ID. The DMV is open during the workday. Who can take off to go to the DMV?
Or if I live in a rural county and the DMV is 10 counties away.
Exactly. Like how do you get to the DMV? Who is more likely to have more direct access to the DMV? It's not necessarily Black voters or other voters of color. So it's really about, it's not the physical ID that's the problem. It's obtaining it and getting it and what's required to get it. There are lots of rural communities, for example, too, that don't have who don't have traditional birth certificates because folks who were born at home, it took them a while. Like I've seen voters whose birth certificate, a 60-year-old Black man in Texas who was born in South Texas, who just didn't have his birth certificate, his name didn't match. And that's not uncommon. It's just because he was born in a super rural place 60 years ago. And so his birth certificate doesn't match his social security, and it just creates all these problems to obtain the ID in the first place. And so it's about obtaining that ID and who is able to do so. And that's why it disproportionately impacts and often creates discriminatory effects on Black people and Black voters.
And the I think the broader picture of that is it's one of the costs of voting that when you add them all together results in Mississippi having a voter turnout and voter registration that is very low. It's also, I think, fundamentally based on a false premise. So the idea that there is voter fraud, particularly voter fraud at a scale that could impact any particular election, there's no evidence of that. And there's organizations who are well-funded who spend a lot of money trying to find voter fraud. If you go, for example, to the Heritage Foundation.
I knew he was going to mention that.
They calculate every time someone has been convicted of voter fraud for over the course of 30 or 40 years. And
it's minuscule.
It's low, and it's definitely not enough to impact an election. So the idea,
something like 0.0001, it's almost incalculable.
You go to the website, it speaks for itself how low it is. But so the voter ID requirement is based on a false premise, and there's many states that don't have a voter ID requirement, and the voting there goes totally fine.
Yeah, and I'll just say this, and then we can go to the next question. I think a lot of times, because we are in Mississippi, we are in the Deep South, it's really easy to have these very polarized conversations where we're saying Black voters or brown voters as a minority voter, but we have to think about minority folks as folks who are low income, folks who are living on the margins of what it means to be marginalized in this country, like folks who really live in the deep parts of rural Mississippi who don't have a P.O. box. So those are the people that we're also talking about, not just brown and Black folks, okay?
Now, getting an ID when you don't have a home address is really hard. Yeah. So.
Do you have another question? Yeah.
So I know recently my name is Tamina McMillan. We recently passed a law so that Juneteenth became a federal holiday.
Yeah.
Which is great, but I thought it would have been better served if like election day became a federal holiday, like most industrializations in this world. Do you ever see that happening in our country where that becomes a national holiday so people can actually be off and spend all day voting if necessary instead of trying to, I mean, I think that would be such an amazing solution, right? To actually have people be off so they can go vote, right?
I trade that for.
Me too.
I trade Juneteenth, one Juneteenth for National Voting Day.
Put it on the list of federal holidays where people actually like have to take off, yeah, or like our employers have to give you off, yeah, that would be, yeah.
Yeah,
I'd love that.
Yeah, one of the things that we're working on organizationally, I think the students might like this a lot, is that on election day, because there are so many barriers for young people to vote. You know, maybe it's your class schedule or your lab schedule. If not a federal holiday, which is what I really want before I leave this life, but if not a federal holiday, we're pushing the legislature to be to mandate with IHL that at minimum people who are attending a university or a college in the state of Mississippi have the election day off to go do whatever they need to do to cast their vote here in Mississippi. So I hope that's something that we can get young people to help us rally behind during the legislative session in January. Right? Right? Yeah? Okay. I see you. I know your name. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm Victoria now. My husband taught philosophy here for 35 years, so that's my association with Millsaps College. But I'm here tonight because I remember the League of Women Voters. And this is real interesting to what you're talking about. I'm a retired social worker advocating for people with disabilities for 40 years. Now I work at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. It's the best job I've had. What I wanted to remind the audience of, if you don't already know, is that the League of Women Voters runs a website called vote411.org. I don't know about you, but it's really hard to find out who's running, except the president, you know that. But who's running on the down ballot? You know, now that we don't get newspapers, I stream my TV shows, vote411.org, and it clears it, but it tells you who's running for what office in your area.
Anybody else? No? I'll also say that there is another engine called Ballot Ready, and it does something similar, but what it also does is it's integrated with the Secretary of State's website, and it allows voters to make their plan to vote, and so they can find their precinct and print off a sample ballot and all this really cool stuff that I think is fun because it integrates to my Google Calendar. So if you're a millennial and it's not on your calendar, it's not real, right? So like it already integrates for you, so I think that's really cool.
And you could also
Yeah.
point out, don't forget Mississippi Today.
That's right.
Where you can find, that's where I get all of my, great,
Yeah.
real accurate information is Mississippi Today. And I think they have a component around elections
They do.
now on the website. So
Mississippi Today
MississippiToday.org.
has a really great voter guide for the state of Mississippi.
I like vote.gov because since it's become from the federal government, you can rely on it to have accurate registration information in all 50 states to help you register. So that's another one I would recommend. And it's easy to remember, so that's why I like.
Yeah, vote.gov is really.
Yeah, just yeah.
So in closing, I see you. Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you guys all for a great panel. I'm Adam, by the way, I'm the team. You talk a lot about the importance of having these conversations with our friends, our peers, our families about voting and sort of economic disparities and the really great importance of these issues. How do you all, being so experienced in these fields, recommend having these conversations in an empathetic and productive manner, right? We live in a very partisan, very divided time. Do you guys have strategies for getting really productive conversations on these topics?
The only time I've ever convinced somebody of something that they didn't believe at the beginning was when I didn't have an agenda. I wasn't actually making any statements. I actually only asked questions the whole time. And then at the end of talking with this, he was actually one of my close friends, he said I changed his mind. And so I find that to be effective.
Yeah. Similarly, I think meeting people where they are and like understanding what they care about and going from there tends to be, at least in my experience, very effective. I think when I'm an issue, I talk a lot about people with felony convictions because it's an area where people don't really think about it a lot. But and someone might initially say, oh, well, if you went to prison, then you do the time, or you do the crime, you do the time. But then I ask people, if you've gone, you've been, you're trying to return to society, you want people to stop committing crimes, and you don't want people to go back to prison because that affects all of us. But what if I told you that allowing people with felony convictions to vote is known to reduce the recidivism rate for people who have been incarcerated there because they feel like they are full citizens like the rest of us. They feel like they have a stake in our democracy and are less likely to commit another felony and go back to prison. And so I think that reminding people just why and that often connects people because it's just, meeting somewhere where they are, just understanding why this is important to them and why this matters to them specifically. In that case, I just believe that it matters to all of us that people don't go back to prison, and so I find that to be an effective way.
I think I agree with Valencia and Josh that it's really having that conversation, open, transparent. Here I am, here are my views, here's why this matters to me. But listening, I think we don't do a lot of listening because if you listen, sometimes you can really hear how they've been impacted or how maybe their views were formed as to why they now think a certain way, which may be fine. I think just having that open conversation where you put the information out there and you allow a person to come to
Their own conclusion.
To their own conclusion. It's not about really trying to forcibly change someone's mind, but giving them information and letting them come to that point. I live in a neighborhood where for the last, for forever, I think, we've been probably one of two Black families in the neighborhood. And so, when I talk to my neighbors, a lot of times I don't get in, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about religion, you just sort of, hi, how you doing, and keep it moving. But when I do get an opportunity to get in those conversations, and they always say, and I have 3 sons, by the way, oh, I love your boys. Oh, your boys. And so when something's happening that then they are, not quite getting as to how that could happen that way or why I should be concerned about it, I said, what about if that was Christian Garrison or Ryan? How would you feel about that happening to them? And so that's a way to sort of get into a conversation because it goes to something that they may care about in the same way that I do. And but those conversations, you have to be careful who you're having those conversations with.
Yeah.
Angela said something earlier about having conversations that meet people's kitchen tables. And I think maybe in this context, it might be their dorm rooms. But it is not about changing people's minds. It's about understanding where they're coming from, whether you agree with them or not. And a lot of times, you will learn a lot, right? And you get an opportunity to, like Josh said, ask more questions. And at the end of the conversation, you might get the outcome you're looking for. But I always tell people, don't go into a conversation about voting with an agenda. Just go into it to be a student and learn, and you can still be friends with somebody on the outside of that.
And lead with empathy. It's really easy
empathy.
It's really easy to write people off because of certain preconceived notions. But I think leading with empathy in those conversations allows people to feel comfortable learning from you too.
Yeah, this has been a really great conversation. I will wrap up with this question to the panelists. What keeps you hopeful about our democracy?
I promise. I think we all are hopeful for what it's worth. It's just, you got to think about it for a second. I think the fact that we're all still here, like, keeps me hopeful. I think the moment that we just like no longer have advocates, no longer have organizers who are doing their best in fighting, then I will feel very scared. I'm already a little scared, but like nerves come with the job. But I think what keeps me hopeful is that we still have people fighting. I always say that if your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't try to take it from you. And so the fact that there are people out here trying to keep that, to keep people, keep people's rights, keep people enfranchised, who are still fighting for this godforsaken country, and still believe, like I do, in its true destiny as a multiracial democracy, keeps me hopeful.
I just look around my community in Jackson and in Mississippi. A lot of people, I remember when I moved here, I'm originally from Memphis. My dad's from the Delta, but I'd never, lived in Mississippi. And I remember I was moving here, one of my friends was like, "Oh, I've never been to Mississippi." And, that's most people and in America. And Mississippi's one of the places that people have never visited and like certainly aren't thinking about moving to. But so here in this place that has that perception, I just see great people, like joy and like lives that people have here is very inspiring. And I think that the election is very important, but those type of communities, those friends, I think will still be here.
For what keeps me hopeful is it's very simple. It is Ryan Young, Christian Wade, Garrison Wade. Those are my three sons. I have to have hope that we will do better, not just in Mississippi, but nationally, that we will do better. So that is the source of my hope.
Thank you all. This has been amazing, right?